I never imagined I'd end up spending my life digging graves. It's not the kind of job you dream about as a kid, nor is it something parents brag about to their neighbors. But when you're broke, directionless, and out of options, even the strangest jobs seem like a blessing. That's how I ended up as a gravedigger at Eternal Peace Valley Cemetery. The job opening appeared on a crumpled flyer pinned to the bulletin board of a roadside market. Gravedigger wanted. Fixed salary. Meals included. On-site accommodation. The strangest part was the footer of the ad. Only applicants willing to follow the rules should apply. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Rules are a part of any job. What isn't common is a chance like that falling into the lap of someone who's lost everything. The cemetery was far from the city, isolated on a nearly abandoned road. When I arrived, an elderly man was waiting for me at the gate. His skin looked like old leather, and his deep-set eyes carried a mix of exhaustion and fear. "Are you the new guy?" he asked, without introducing himself. I nodded. He handed me a yellowed envelope and pointed to a small shed near the graves. "Read this before you start, and please follow every rule." Inside the envelope was an aged sheet of paper with a handwritten list of instructions. Rules of Eternal Peace Valley Cemetery. 1. Lock the gate before sunset. 2. If you hear someone calling your name at night, don't look back. 3. Never dig a grave that's not on the official burial list. 4. If you find coins on a grave, don't touch them. 5. If you see a tall man in a suit among the graves, pretend he's not there. 6. Never stay in the cemetery after 3 a.m. At the bottom, there was an underlined warning. The last gravedigger who broke one of these rules was never seen again. I looked at the old man, expecting him to laugh or say it was a joke, but he just turned his back and walked away, as if he didn't want to stay there any longer than necessary. That night, I made sure to lock the gate before sunset. I didn't know it then, but that was the only peaceful night I'd have. My first week at the cemetery was strangely calm. The work was simple. Dig, seal the graves, and make sure everything was in order. The shed where I slept was cramped, but at least it had a decent mattress and an old stove where I could heat up something to eat. The problem was the rules. No matter how hard I tried not to think about them, they were always there, lingering in my mind. Why couldn't I touch the coins? Who was the man in the suit? What would happen if I stayed after 3 a.m.? On the fourth night, something strange happened. I was closing the gate when I heard my name whispered. Low, dragged out, as if the wind itself was calling me. Hector. My blood ran cold. I turned my head from side to side, trying to find who had spoken, but the cemetery was completely empty. Then I remembered Rule 2. If you hear someone calling your name at night, don't look back. My heart raced. The sound had come from behind me, but I couldn't look. The whisper came again, closer this time. Hector. My fingers trembled as I locked the gate. Every part of my body screamed at me to turn around, to face it once and for all. But I didn't turn. I locked the chain and ran into the shed, slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, hearing the whispers grow fainter until they disappeared. The next day, I went to the old gravedigger, the man who had welcomed me on my first night. I found him sitting on a stone bench, smoking a cigarette with trembling hands. I heard my name last night, I said, sitting next to him, but I didn't look back. He exhaled the smoke slowly, without looking at me. So, you survived your first time. That sent a chill down my spine. What happens if I look? He crushed a cigarette under his boot, stood up, and started walking away. But before disappearing among the graves, he murmured, "No one ever told me." From that night on, I knew something was deeply wrong with that cemetery, and sooner or later, I would find out why. After that night, I started paying closer attention. At first, I thought I was becoming paranoid, but the cemetery felt alive. Graves I was sure had been intact in the morning appeared cracked at night. Wooden crosses shifted positions for no reason. And always, there was that feeling that something was watching me between the tombstones. But it was on the sixth night that everything really changed. It was pouring rain, and I was sheltering in the shed when I heard the noise. Clang, clang. It sounded like metal hitting stone. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was the wind throwing something against the graves. But then the sound came again, louder this time. I didn't want to go out, but against my own will, I grabbed a lantern and went to see what it was. The noise was coming from an old tombstone, covered in moss. On the ground, there was a small pile of coins. Not just a few, dozens of them, scattered in a strange way, as if they had been left in a hurry. Rule 4. If you find coins on a grave, don't touch them. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I bent down and hesitantly picked up one of the coins between my fingers. It was as cold as ice, even in my warm hand. There was something strange about its texture. It felt damp. But when I held it up to the lantern light, a shiver ran through me. The coin was stained with dry blood. I dropped it immediately and backed away, but it was too late. The metallic sound started again. Clang, clang. Only this time, it was coming from beneath the earth. The ground beneath my feet began to move. Something was trying to crawl out of the grave. I stumbled back, nearly falling. The rain grew heavier. The wind howled around me, and I could barely see. But then I noticed the coins. They were gone. A heavy thud sounded behind me, as if something had just risen from the grave. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran back to the shed and locked the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Outside, the noise stopped. But now, every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me in the dark. The next day, I found a freshly dug grave. No name, no markings, and beside it, there was a single coin. After that night, nothing seemed normal anymore. The cemetery was already a disturbing place on its own, but now there was a presence there. Something I couldn't see, but I knew was there. I avoided looking at the grave where the coins had disappeared from, but every time I passed it, I felt a chill run up my spine, as if something down there was waiting for me. I needed answers. I went to the old Gravedigger, the one who had given me the rules on my first day. I found him sitting on the same stone bench as always, a lit cigarette between his trembling fingers. He didn't even need to look at me to know what I wanted. "You touched them, didn't you?" he asked, exhaling a cloud of smoke. I swallowed hard. "Just one." He shook his head slowly. "It's always like this. First curiosity, then fear." He crushed the cigarette out and turned to face me, finally meeting my gaze. "Do you think this cemetery is just a resting place for the dead, kid?" I didn't answer. He sighed and pointed to the tombstones around us. "What do you see?" I analyzed the tombstones. They were old, many covered in moss. Some were so worn that the names were illegible. But beyond that, there was nothing unusual. "Tombstones," I replied. The Gravedigger laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of humor. "No, you're only seeing the ones that want to be seen." A heavy silence settled between us. "What does that mean?" I asked. He gave me a tired look. "This cemetery has an ancient history, much older than the official records say. People were buried here long before it was even a cemetery. People who shouldn't have been. Many of them don't rest. And some don't want to be here alone." The cold I felt in that moment didn't come from the wind. "And the coins?" The Gravedigger hesitated before answering. "A coin on a grave is a warning, a payment. Someone left it there to keep the dead below. If you took one," he took a deep drag, his gaze darkening. "Someone got out." My mouth went dry. "Who?" He stood up and gave me a pat on the shoulder. like a father who had given up warning his child about danger. I don't know, and if you're smart, you won't want to find out. Then he walked away, leaving me alone in the middle of the cemetery. That night, while I tried to sleep, I heard footsteps outside the shed, slow, dragging, the sound of bare feet on the wet earth, and then a soft knock on the door. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath. The knock came again. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. My whole body was frozen in fear. The silence stretched on, and then, from outside, a low, hoarse, unfamiliar voice whispered, "You took my coin." I didn't move. I didn't blink. I could barely breathe. The voice outside was soft, almost a murmur, but there was something about it, something that made my stomach churn. You took my coin. Whatever was out there, it knew. The shed's door was thin, made of old wood, and in that moment it seemed fragile. I could feel the presence on the other side, still waiting. Tap, tap, tap. Another knock. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. I felt cold sweat running down my neck. I wanted to look out the window, wanted to see who was there, but I didn't have the courage, because deep down I knew it wasn't someone. I curled up against the wall, my eyes fixed on the door. The seconds dragged on, and the only sound was the tapping of the light rain on the zinc roof. Then the footsteps began, slow, dragging, moving away from the shed, but not toward the cemetery gate. The footsteps were heading inside, toward the graves. I stayed awake until dawn, waiting for some sign that it would return, but it didn't, at least not that night. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, the cemetery was covered in a low mist, the tombstones hiding beneath the white veil. The gate was still locked, no footprints in the mud, no sign that anyone had been there. But there was something in front of my door, a coin, the same one I had picked up. I didn't touch it. I just stepped back, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. I needed answers. I walked through the cemetery searching for the old gravedigger, but he wasn't on the stone bench, nor near the graves. I couldn't find him anywhere, but as I walked between the tombstones, something caught my attention. A tombstone, different from the others. It was larger, made of black marble, and it only had one name on it, Tiberio Vasquez. No dates, no epitaph, and on the ground, dozens of coins scattered. The same name whispered through my mind. I had heard that name before, but where? That's when I realized. There was a footprint mark leading away from the grave. I didn't need anything else to know. The thing that visited me last night came from here. But the question that haunted me was, who the hell was Tiberio Vasquez? And even worse, why did he come after me? The name Tiberio Vasquez stuck in my mind. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it kept coming back, like an echo in the dark. I knew I shouldn't, but something inside me screamed for answers. Who was this man? Why was his grave filled with coins? And most importantly, why did he come after me? That night, I decided to break another rule. I grabbed a lantern and headed to the shed where the cemetery's old records were kept. I wasn't the first gravedigger at that place. Many had come before me, and if Tiberio Vasquez was buried there, his name should be in some document. The archive shed was a place few ever entered. The shelves were covered in dust, infested with moths, and the smell of old paper mixed with the mold on the walls. I pulled one of the record books. The pages were fragile, and most of the names were people who had died decades ago. I turned page by page, desperately searching for any mention of Tiberio Vasquez. And then I found it. His name was there, but something was wrong. Unlike the other records, where there were birth and death dates, the space where Tiberio's death year should have been was blank. I frowned. How could it be blank? I kept reading, and that's when my blood ran cold. Tiberio Vasquez wasn't an ordinary man. He had been a gravedigger, the gravedigger before the previous one. The same position I held now. My heart hammered in my chest. The record said that he had worked at the cemetery for 20 years, until suddenly he disappeared. His body was never found. But a grave was made for him anyway, as a way to keep him buried. I remembered the coins. A payment, a warning, something to keep the dead down. But I touched them. I picked them up, and now Tiberio wasn't down there anymore. I let the book fall to the floor. My hands were shaking. What had I done? That's when I heard the noise. Outside, slow, dragging footsteps. Exactly like the night before. I gripped the lantern tightly. I couldn't move. Terror had me frozen in place. The footsteps stopped right at the shed door. And then, tap, tap, tap. The same knocking, the same insistence. But this time, the voice that followed was clearer. Closer. You took my coin, now I take your place. The lantern flickered, and the door began to open. The door slowly creaked open, its rusted hinges squealing. The sound made the air around me freeze, as if the very night was closing in on me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was paralyzed, as if something invisible was holding me in place, forcing me to face what was coming. And then he appeared. Tiberio Vasquez was no longer the man I imagined. He wasn't just a decrepit corpse or a wandering specter. He was standing there before me with an appearance that defied any logical explanation. His skin was pale, almost translucent, as though he were on the brink of decomposition, but not completely decayed. His eyes, however, were the most disturbing part, black as night, with no reflection of light. He stood there as though he had just risen from the grave. The smell of damp earth and rotten flesh surrounded him, a nauseating mixture that made me feel like I was about to throw up. Tiberio slowly moved closer, his footsteps heavy and dragging, but there was no sound. He was floating, not touching the ground. His lips moved, but there was no sound, only a muffled whisper that made my mind spin. It was as if the wind itself was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand. You took my coin, he whispered, his voice an eerie drawl, as if it were coming from a pit. My heart raced. He continued, the smile on his face crooked, almost mocking me. Now, I'll take you. With a swift motion, he reached out his hand. I knew I should run, but my body was completely frozen. His fingers were long, thin, and wrapped in a dark mist that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Tiberio's hand reached out to grab me, and everything around me began to distort. Shadows crawled along the walls of the shed, and the environment began to spin, as if reality itself were unraveling. The air grew heavier, denser, and I started having trouble breathing. I tried to move, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground, as if the earth itself was holding me down. There was a growing pressure on my shoulders, like something invisible was pulling me down into the depths of the earth. Tiberio was too close. He was in my head, whispering, making time feel like it was folding in on itself. Every word he said echoed inside me, like a clock that wouldn't stop ticking. Every tick, a shiver. Every talk, a growing fear. Finally, I managed to move. With desperate effort, I pushed the shed door, making it slam shut with a loud bang. The moment the door slammed, the pressure vanished. I was free from his influence, for now. But when I looked back, I saw he was still there. He didn't move, just stared at me with those black eyes, empty as the void. His lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of satisfaction. It was a smile of understanding, as if he knew that in the end, there was no escaping. I didn't know exactly what he wanted, but now I was sure of one thing. Tiberio Vasquez wasn't a man who had died and been buried. He was death itself, a guardian who never truly left but waited in silence, waiting for someone who dared to break the rules of the cemetery. And I had been that someone.